All right, so here we are working with exercise 9. We're in painting and rendering, and we're working with gradients and blends. So the first thing we're going to look at here is the gradient panel. So what the gradient panel does is it allows you to add multiple colors to an object that blend together to get seamless gradients. And we'll see that there's a lot of options of how we can adjust those gradients and modify them to get a really cool effect with rendering things. So there's going to be two types of gradients we're going to go over. We're going to go over what's called a linear gradient. So that's just a gradient moving from one side to another side. And then we're also going to go over what's called a radial gradient, which is a color moving from the center point axis and moving out. So these are radial or elliptical. All right, so let's dive in. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this big rectangular shape right here, and then I'm going to open up my gradient panel. So I can come over here to the dock, and it's an icon that looks like this, or I can go up to window and go down to gradient. And so I'm actually going to pull this panel off of the dock so it's easier to work with, and I'll expand it a little bit more so we can see how this works. Okay, so once I've opened up the gradient panel, I need to make sure that I have first selected an object, otherwise it's not going to do anything. But now that this object is selected, if I just click once on this gradient slider, so it's this large preview of a gradient right here, now it actually changes that object into a gradient. So what we're looking at here in the gradient slider, down here are the individual colors. These are called color stops. So right now by default it's just giving us black and white. We can actually move these, and we can see how as I move the color stop over, it starts to spread that color farther into the object, and if I go back it'll spread it away. Right here, this little diamond on top, this is called the midpoint indicator. This is the point where you get a 50-50 blend between the two colors. So I could also change that. I could make it more of a white dominant blend, or I could make it more of a black dominant blend. So right now up here we can see the type. We're working with linear. If I wanted to, I could change it to radial, but for now let's stick with working on linear. I can also choose to adjust a gradient on the stroke. So if I click right here, I can activate a stroke gradient. So right now it's just showing me we have a red stroke, but if I click the gradient panel, it'll actually add a gradient to my stroke. And there's different ways that the stroke will be rendered. So right now by default it's applying the gradient just like the object from one side to the other. I could click on this other one and it blends it along the stroke, so you're going to see it actually has a shift in the corner right here from the gradient. Make sure that object is still selected, and then we can also do a gradient that moves from the, I'll zoom in a little bit closer so we can see that. So we can see on this stroke it's actually moving the gradient from the inside to the outside, which is pretty cool. Right here, this is the gradient reversal button. Make sure my object is selected, and if I click this, the reversal, it'll flip that, and I'll just go back to my fill and zoom out, and I'll do the same thing on the fill. I'll reverse it. So now we can see it change that gradient. Okay, the other thing we can do is we can change the angle of the gradient. So by default it moves from left to right at a 90-degree angle, or horizontal angle. If I wanted to, I could actually start to give this a little bit of an angle. So now it's moving more from the bottom corner up to the upper right hand corner. Okay, I could go all the way to 45 degrees, which is diagonal, and 180 degrees, which is essentially flipping it. I can also go in the opposite direction too. So I could do a negative 90-degree angle and flip it, so now it's moving up and down. Alright, so when we use gradients, usually we like to add other colors. When you use the gradient panel, it's usually a good idea to use it in tandem with your swatches panel. But before we do that, I'm just going to show you another way you can start to add colors into your gradient. So if you come down here to one of your color stops, and I'll actually double click on this, you'll either open up this color panel here, or if you click right here on the swatches icon, you can open up your swatches panel right within the gradient panel. So I'll go ahead and change that to another color. So if I go back into the color panel, we'll see that we have some options for adjusting that color. So I could adjust the red, green, and blue values. I could come up here and click the options icon, and I could adjust the hue, saturation, and brightness. I could maybe make that a little bit darker. And I could also change the CMYK and the WebSafe RGB colors. So I'll do the same thing for this white over here. I'll double click and I'll choose a swatch first. So maybe I'll choose this light blue, and then I'll further adjust that blue, and I think I'll use the hue, saturation, and brightness. I'll bring down the saturation and just click outside when you're done. So that's another way of adding color to your gradients. There's yet another way to add more colors into here. So by default, if I just hover right on the bottom part of this gradient slider and click once, it's going to add either this gradient stop or this gradient stop. It's going to add a copy of that. So now I have a whole nother copy of that color on there. And I could do this ad infinitum. I could just keep adding colors, and I could double click on them and change their relative values. So I could start to add some different color values in here, and I could start moving those around. But what if I need to get rid of some of these colors? Well, you can see every time I click on one of these stoppers, this triangle above it becomes filled with black. That means it's selected. I can come over here to this trash can icon and click once, and I'll start actually getting rid of those color stops that I don't need. The other cool way of getting rid of these is just clicking on one of them and then dragging off of the panel, and that pulls it right off of the gradient slider. So that's another cool way of adding and subtracting colors. One more way we can add colors is with one of the color stops selected, I can hold down on my Alt key and I can click and drag and make a copy of that color, and then I could come in and start to further edit the existing colors that we have on here. Alright, so last couple of things I'd like to show you with this is we can actually change the opacity of each one of these colors. So if you remember, the opacity is like how much of the either the object or the color that we can see. So let's say I want this middle part to be somewhat transparent. So I'm going to click on this color stop, and I'll come over here to opacity and I'll set it to 0. And you can see that it's now actually a clear color stop right here in the middle. You can see kind of this like clear grid behind it, and it's going to show whatever is behind it. So I could actually do that with this one as well. Maybe I'll set this one to 50%, and now you can see we're getting some really fine-tuned gradients that can actually blend into the underlying artwork, which is a really cool tool to be able to use when working in Illustrator. So I could continue to fine-tune this. Maybe I want to move my midpoint indicators over to show a little bit more of one color than the other. Alright, and so the last thing I wanted to show you is the fact that you can open up the Swatches panel, and I'll just pull this out so it's easier to see. And I can actually just take colors from my Swatches panel. You need to be careful though. If I just click once, I'm going to change this whole gradient. So what I need to do is click and hold down and then drag this into the gradient panel. You can see I get a plus sign. It means it's going to add it to the gradient. If I release the mouse, it adds that color to my gradient. And if I wanted to, I could get rid of it. I'll go ahead and add a green here. Click and hold and drag that in. Green. I'll add a yellow. Click and hold, add yellow. Maybe I'll get rid of this one. Now, if I create a gradient and I want to save the gradient for future use, it's just like how we save all our other swatches. So with this object selected, in the Swatches panel, I could click New Swatch, and it's asking us to name the new gradient swatch. So I'll just name it Nick Gradient and click OK. You can see here in the Swatches panel, we have that gradient loaded and saved. So to test this, I'll go ahead and click that object and change it to a red, and then I'll click it and then I'll choose my gradient swatch, and there you can see it has saved the gradient in the Swatches panel, and we can use this for future use. Alright, so let's move on over to the radial gradient. So I'll click on this circle, and with that selected, I'll go ahead and click on my gradient tool, and it applies usually your last gradient. So I could come in here and start throwing away the colors. I'm clicking and just pulling these off. Alright, and let's just work with 3 colors. Alright, let's change the type. Radial. So now you can see we're moving from a center point and moving outwards. If I wanted to, I could switch it. So reverse the gradient. I could adjust these color stops and the midpoint indicators. Okay, I could adjust, well, the angle you're not going to see much because we haven't done anything to the relative proportions of the ellipse. So if I come down here, this is called the aspect ratio. So what it's doing is it's going to change the up and down and side to side proportions. So if we go from 100% to, let's say, 10%, it flattens the gradient. Okay, so now it's a small flattened ellipse, and then I could change the angle. I'll just bring this back to 0. You can see 50% opens it a little bit more. Now if we go above 100%, now it's going to start stretching it beyond the bounds of the object. So we can't see it right now, but the gradient actually comes out to here and here. I'll be a little more extreme. I'll go to 600%. So now it's almost turning into a linear gradient, but it's actually a big ellipse. And so I'll change the angle on this just to get some contrast. 45 degrees, and maybe I'll bring this down to 200. And once again, I could change the opacity. So maybe on the outside of the gradient, I want this blue to kind of fade into nothing. So I'm going to move this over, hold down on the Alt key, and make a copy of that. And then I'll change that opacity to 0. And kind of move these around a little bit and see if I can get this effect where it looks like this is kind of fading away on the edges. I'll move the midpoint indicator over a little bit more. And there we go. All right, I like that. So another thing we can do to find other gradients is look for gradient libraries in the Swatches panel. So if you guys remember from working with Swatches before, if we come down over here to the libraries menu and come down here to gradients, you'll see that we actually have a huge list of different kinds of gradients that are pre-made and preset. So this is kind of a good starting point when you're needing to render things and you don't want to spend time actually creating all new colors to create things. So for instance, wood. So if I pull up that, I can see that they have quite a few different gradients just for wood colors. So I'll go ahead and try one of these, change this gradient I have right here. This would be a light pine color, cherry, walnut, maple. So just know that you have a large library of gradients to choose from when you're working on rendering things in Illustrator.